In this interview, we're speaking with guitarist, composer, author, and visionary educator Rory Stuart, all about the art and craft of practicing. In addition to releasing several acclaimed albums as a leader, Rory has performed as a sideman with a wide range of legendary artists, from brother Jack McDuff and Bill Doggett to Steve Coleman's early M-Bass group, alongside Jerry Allen and Cassandra Wilson. As an educator, Rory has shaped generations of improvisers through decades of teaching at the New School, where he designed and taught the rhythm curriculum, transforming how musicians internalize time, feel, and phrasing. He's also the author of the 6-volume Rhythm Book series, reshaping how players practice and develop rhythmic mastery. So let's dive in. Let's start off by sort of taking it to real basics. Can we establish a definition of practicing? What does it mean to practice? What do you hope to accomplish in a good practice session?
Okay, I'm going to tell you what I mean by practice, but it's different than what a lot of people mean.
Okay.
So if you wanted to extend the name for what I'm saying, you could call it purposeful practice. So I know many friends who aren't professional musicians, and they play a little guitar, they know a few songs, and they pick up the guitar and they play those songs, and they do them pretty much the same every time, but there's no evidence that they've gotten any better at them through the years. And if they picked up the guitar, I guess they would call what they're doing practicing.
Okay.
But if you ask them what the purpose was, I guess they would say, well, it's fun to play the guitar. That's great. That's no problem. But what I mean by practice is something where you have a purpose. You have some goals. You figure out what to do to move you towards those goals. And you may or may not succeed at moving towards those goals, but you're doing something with purpose. By the way, I run as a hobby. I've done a lot of races and stuff, and I find the same distinction with runners. There are plenty of runners that go out because it's fun to run. I mean, that's a purpose, to go out and have some fun and relax. But if you check out the runners who get to a very high level, there's a reason that they're doing every workout. This time they want to work on their VO2 max. This time they want to work on their lactate threshold, blah, 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 endurance, So I don't want to forget to quote something that I read from McCoy Tyner that influenced me always about thinking about this. He said, if you only have 15 minutes a day, but every time you go to your instrument, there's something you're working on, and at the end of 15 minutes, you're better at it than when you started. It's only a matter of time, and you'll become great. Thought, wow, that's interesting, right? I mean, that because people can pick up an instrument for an hour and not even try to get anything better at anything. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when I'm talking about practice, I'm saying I have things I want to improve on, and I'm going to figure out what to do that allows me for that improvement. The other thing to add to it, it's to do it with a purpose. And then also, I have to say, I would approach this almost in a scientific way. That is, like you've got a hypothesis, and then you want to objectively study the results. So you could think, I want to get better at doing X. Then I'm going to spend, I'm going to work on this thing. But then you have to look and say, oh, did I actually get better at X? And one of the things that I've noticed from the wonderful opportunity I've had to work with so many great students of the years is that it's not cookie cutter. People really are different. Everybody doesn't have the same learning styles. A certain thing that works great for this one student, another student, it's absolutely useless. I can give you an example, just so it's not completely hypothetical, or abstract. Etudes, like writing your own etude and practicing it. I've had certain students who love to do that and get radically better at doing a certain thing because of composing and practicing their own etudes. I've had other students who have no interest in that, and if they try to do it, it's a totally empty thing. They don't get any better at the thing. It's not the way for them to get better. So when you're starting out especially, you don't know what it is that's going to work best for you. And even if you have really good teachers, one of the things is to observe in yourself what it is that works for you.
Right. Do you find that to be a problem with a lot of teachers, and that maybe they're too set in their ways and they have a predefined practice routine or structure that doesn't?
It's a factory, and each student comes in there and they go through the factory thing, and the student and the teacher gets the money, and everyone's thinks they're happy. No, I mean, this is a
Right.
little bit cynical view of teaching, but uh, well, people watching should know that I've cheated a little bit because Greg sent me some questions he had in mind, and so I wanted to relate this to a particular question about how things develop, how they change in your practice from when you're a beginner to more advanced. So I had a singer I played with years ago who also had been studying guitar, had been taking guitar lessons for about 20 years. Now you can imagine from the point of view of someone who's teaching and trying to make a bunch of money at it, this is wonderful. Like students who take regular lessons for 20 years, oh my God, they don't, they have to get enough of them and they're bringing in all this money, right?
Right.
Well, it was incredible because this person, after 20 years, each week she would go and the teacher would show her, now put your finger here, and now put your finger there, do this. And she would memorize that, and then she would repeat it so that she could do it quicker.
Okay.
And then she would go the next week and do more of that. So my model, my cliche for that is, he gave her a lot of fish, but he never taught her how to fish. After 20 years, she didn't have any idea how he came up with the things that he told her to do. Well, that's, so
So it sounds like you're emphasizing the importance of knowing how to practice, knowing what to prescribe yourself.
right. And those friends of mine that I mentioned who just as a hobby, they pick up the guitar and play a few songs I know, they play the things the same every time. They don't know how to, when they play a C major, they're playing cowboy chords. People get pissed off at that word, but I don't mean this in a pejorative way. I started out playing cowboy chords. I remember
Sure.
neighborhood
the basic.
kid taught me how to play the Beatles and I Love Her.
Sure.
B minor, great, no problem. But they don't know any other way to play that chord. They don't know where the notes are on the guitar neck. They don't understand how harmony works. They don't know, forget about inversions and stuff. They don't know anything about harmony. They're just, it's a neuromuscular thing. And to me, that would be pretty boring. Well, and then of course you understand why someone that's like that takes a lesson or tries to watch some YouTube thing and memorize some other thing. But right, to me, you've been playing guitar a long time. Every time I pick a guitar, it's endlessly fascinating. There's always new paths to take. There are always new things to work on.
Right.
There's not any element of it that's boredom because I can't think of anything interesting to do. It never happens.
And it sounds
So-
like you're talking about a different kind of learning, which is really a more holistic approach, I guess, rather than just play this by rote, play this by rote. You're
Right.
showing
It's
them.
part of it is it's understanding music.
Yes.
There's a lot to understand about the guitar physically and how, fingering wise and picking, technique and all, but also to understand stuff about music.
Sure. What I'm wondering is, as a teacher, in order to prescribe the right kind of learning or the right kind of practicing for a student, when you get a new student, are there certain things that you'll run that student through in order to assess how they learn best?
Sometimes it's hard to peg that immediately, but I can sort of feel what things someone tends to gravitate towards. But sometimes that's because of familiarity. In other words, they might be used to learning things a certain way, and trying something else is a little bit uncomfortable at first because it's not familiar. But if they give it a try, maybe it turns out that works great for them. So sometimes I need a little bit of empirical feedback. I see what happens in the second lesson and the third lesson. So sometimes you have to fine tune it by seeing, what's working for the student and getting their feedback about
There's
that
a little
also.
bit of trial and error, but you fine tune it over a few lessons.
Yeah.
It's interesting just to even talk about the difference between beginners, even if they're adults, and then more intermediate players.
Well, here is something that I feel is kind of an interesting challenge as a teacher when someone's really a beginner. So I think back about when I began. So I learned these few cowboy chords, but quickly my neighborhood kids showed me a song or two that used them. And I then spent a lot of time doing two things. One was just trying to get from whatever, A minor to E minor quickly. In other words, when you first do it, you're like one finger at a time, putting it down on the neck, right? And so you want to be able to go dum, 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 dum. So going back and forth, back and forth. Yeah. So neuromuscular. And also, I remember at that time, maybe it was a guitar I had, the tips of my fingers hurt like hell.
Yes.
So I decided, tough love. So I would just hold one of these chords as hard as I could for a long time, which would be pretty painful. And then I started building calluses. Okay, so but the dilemma is how to balance the teaching how to fish and giving fish. Because after all, if somebody's hungry and you spend 3 months all about the theory about how to fish, they don't have any fish, right? So you've got to find the right balance where this is great. They're making some sounds, they're excited about it, it's happy, but they're also learning the underlying things so that they can not just be like my student, like my friend who spent 20 years learning by rote, So I feel like that's a little different from person to person, and you got to figure out what will rock their boat and how much they need fish right away versus how much.
Yeah, I like that. So the idea is that you want to make sure that they're getting some win, some satisfaction, and it's not just all theoretical.
Right.
So maybe.
Yeah. And there's another thing that I think is worth mentioning, since both of you and I have done some teaching, and the way the world is now, it's sort of easy to fall into this mindset that someone either has to have really good teachers, or a question you have later we'll talk about, can they learn things by watching random YouTube clips? And so it's, for a second I'm going to digress. If you think about somebody with a computer and they get a new software application, so you know how I'll give two extremes. There's one kind of person that only does a few things that they know how to do and the book says do this and do this, and there's another kind of person who just tries every damn thing they can think of and stumbles across all this stuff. And very often, for some reason, people are afraid with music to explore. If they don't know what the notes are on the 8th, 9th, and 10th fret, their hands will never go there. I'm talking about beginners, of course.
Right. Are they just afraid of getting yelled at by their teacher for hitting the wrong note?
So on the one hand, as a teacher, to kind of give people the sense, like if they play something here, well, find those same notes over here, right? And once they have the understanding that they can find the notes there, they don't need me to show them the notes, they can find the notes.
Sure.
So it's like someone who sort of realizes like, oh, I can try all the different shortcuts on the computer for this application. They can try different things and see how they sound, see what works. But the other thing that's interesting is, now this is a little bit specific to jazz. Early on, I mostly am self-taught. I'm trying to figure out how to do things. This is before we had slow down programs and all this stuff. And there was like some horn player who was playing a great solo. And I thought, what the heck is this guy doing? So I started transcribing it. I mean, laborious. My ears weren't that used to that. I'm listening over and over again, finding a few notes
Right.
And then finally learning it. If you but in that process, people don't think that working that hard is even an option. But if you're willing to work that hard, I mean, if someone wants to learn rock tunes, reggae tunes, whatever, I mean, it's like, here's the recording. Figure out what they're doing. I mean, find it. You know, it might take a while.
Right.
That could be someone who doesn't understand anything about theory. But if they develop their ear, and I often call this ear, but it's the ear-guitar connection, where if you hear something, you can play it. If somebody develops that far enough, they could become a darn good musician without having a lot of basic skills that we would think you always have to teach a student, right?
Sure.
I mean, they could play every inversion without knowing what an inversion is because they hear them.
It's like the language is very pure. It sounds like that way. You just
it's
know
like they don't know what
intuitively.
They don't know what a noun and a verb is, and they don't know how to spell anything, and they don't know how to read anything, right? Because they can't read music, and they might not even know what the names of the notes are. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm giving an extreme example, right? But anyway, it's sort of interesting. So I'm trying to incorporate a certain element where it's not just cerebral. You got to get the things in your ear. You've got to connect them to the instrument. And you've also got to be willing to put in some sweat equity, listening to things and just figuring them out. Because as painful as that is at first, it's pretty breathtaking how much better it gets through time if you do it. You know, it's not always going to be as difficult as it is now. And it's funny because I can go back to some of these solos I was transcribing way back then, and there'd be some little phrase that was killing me. And now it's like totally obvious what it is. Right. Partly it's from knowing the language of the music, right? So you just know what the person's playing. You hear it and it's obvious.
A lot of players, when they get to more advanced levels, I think they, at that point, have learned to a large degree how to practice and probably stop seeking out an actual teacher. I'm always fascinated when I hear about the real legendary greats and they still have a teacher. You know, and some do.
And let me, okay, first I'm going to say how honored I've been at some incredible musicians who've come to me for one-on-one rhythm lessons, like professional, famous people, people that are more widely known than I am. I mean, who are amazing musicians. And it's also interesting when someone comes with that background and then I'm showing them some rhythmic thing they didn't know, they might not pick that up faster than a college student would. But as soon as they get it, whoa, they're playing like amazing stuff with it, right? So however, I'm a midget compared to a giant, just in terms of doing this a lot, who's not alive anymore, Charlie Banakis. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you know about Charlie Banakis, but I mean, I remember some faculty members at New School, friends of mine, standing outside the building, and I'm listening to them have this conversation. And this guy's been doing lessons for 17 years with Charlie Banakis, and this other guy, you know. Now, Charlie Banakis was very much focused on harmony and melody, and he did a little bit of stuff with rhythm, but some Charlie Banakis students have come to me for rhythmic things. Wow. But man, this guy was getting top professional musicians to study with you for 17 years, and they're playing with famous people all over the world. Mm-hmm. You got to have something that's rocking their world, you know? So
what other ways do you think such a top player benefits from still studying with a private teacher beyond just, you know, maybe certain material that they're showing them? Are there other things?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. First of all, I'm going to give a part of this that seems like I'm trivializing the whole thing. I call this the mannequin effect, but that's a reference to something that won't mean anything unless I describe it. It doesn't matter. Imagine that you could clone Greg Fine. Now there's Greg Fine 1 and there's Greg Fine 2. Well, Greg Fine 2 doesn't know anything that Greg Fine 1 doesn't know, but Greg Fine 1 is going to Greg Fine 2 as a teacher. Each week, Greg Fine 2 is assigning specific things to Greg Fine 1, and the next week, Greg Fine 1 is coming back having mastered them. There's value in that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy. There's value in that.
Yes.
Most people are not that organized, that structured, that disciplined to keep doing that through their whole life. So that's the seemingly trivial thing, but it's not inconsequential.
No.
Okay.
So for the self-directed student, though, who doesn't have that teacher, do you recommend that they video themselves or audio record themselves during their practice?
Yep. I do recommend that. And now I should digress for just a second on that, because early on, not mostly being self-taught, although I had a great mentor in my friend Tuck Andrus, who's crazy. If any of your listeners haven't checked out Tuck Andrus, to me, this is on the guitar now. I mean, it's unfair to say this is the cat, but this guy is really amazing. I mean, there are a lot of people that are probably more famous that aren't like at the place that Tuck's at.
Sure.
But so I have had great fortune with having like a friend. He and I exchanged letters for years. You know, he's been like a great influence. But a lot of times I was figuring stuff out by myself, and I realized I better record myself. And then I didn't have a teacher. I'm listening back to myself. And I just want to say for any listeners, if you have the experience I had, because there was nothing more important to me in my life right then than music. And I would listen back, and it was tremendously depressing. I sounded really bad, and I felt, it's not exaggerating this to say despair. It's like, oh, of course, when something's so painful, it's difficult to keep doing it. It's very tempting to not record yourself and listen with this kind of objective, I shouldn't say objective, but with this critical ear. So I've got two suggestions if this is your experience, if you're a student doing this, whether with a teacher or on your own. The first is, remember when I said about if Greg Fine could clone himself? Pretend there's a clone of you, and the clone is the person who played on the recording, and you're their teacher. If you were their teacher, it's not this emotionally laden thing about how great or bad they play something. You just listen, and first of all, the thing you would hear objectively, like, oh, you got to work, this doesn't sound very good. You got to figure out how to, And the other thing is, you wouldn't be blind to the things that are good, because that's a very interesting thing. If there's something that's bad, at least in my experience back then, listening back to yourself, this thing was so clouding my judgment that I didn't hear the things that were good. And I remember a moment when it was the first recording I ever did in New York that never got released. And there was it might have been 4 or 6 bars. There was one moment on this one piece that I phrased things differently than I usually did, not thinking of it in advance, just in the moment I did it. And listening back to the tape, I suddenly realized oh, that sounds good. And which was wonderful, because I sort of realized that was like a tunnel, like a pathway. Thought, oh, I could go further with that. So it's important to hear the good things and the bad things. And if you were the guy's teacher, you would notice both of them. Yeah. So just try to listen that way, and it's not such an emotionally laden thing. You just, this isn't so good. Oh, this is really, you want to use that. I think it's very useful to listen back to yourself. Another thing, by the way, that's sort of interesting, when you talk about ear training, just, on the one hand, it's being able to hear something and play it on the guitar. So being able to play what you hear on the guitar is important. But the other thing with this is you want to be able to hear more, right? And it's the same sort of thing. I think it's useful for a student to try to, it's a funny process, to try to hear, I guess you'd say visualize, but this is really like oralize, in your head. Picture that you're on a stage in 5 years and you sound the way you want to sound. Really try to hear it. It's not just like, oh, I'll be really cool. It's like, try to actually imagine yourself on that stage, and what does it sound like? Because if you can have a vision of your playing, if you can have that, again, when I say vision, but it's like an oral vision of this, if you can have that clearly enough, that can help shape what you need to practice, what you need to work on. And by the way, you might have a case, I always read, there were loads of people that told Thelonious Monk to his face, man, that you can't play, that's terrible. You go back and listen to Art Tatum more. In other words, you might have a vision that your teacher doesn't understand. So stick with your vision. Right. But the thing is, a lot of times people they need to hear more and they don't have a vision. And a teacher might be able to point them to things to listen to that they've never heard. There's many different ways to work on things.
Rory, I want to ask you about your note-taking during practicing. I saw that you have a journal of notes.
Yeah. So this is totally an individual thing. I mentioned this thing about McCoy Tyner and spending 15 minutes and getting better at something. But of course, many of us had a period where we spent a lot of time, and I still do actually, and it's completely an individual thing. So in my case, I find it somewhat reinforcing. I'm a little bit nerdy like this to sort of keep track of my work. And I dug out, for Greg's benefit, something I haven't looked at for many years, me at age 22 in Paris, by keeping by hand journals of all the topics I was working on. And
it looks like you were drinking some coffee as well.
Right. And how many minutes on each of them I was spending each day, et cetera. And a lot of those were 8 and 10 hour days. I mean, I was practicing a lot. But something interesting about that. So I find that's a little bit reinforcing, and it also helps me be clear that I don't just keep doing the thing that I like to do that I'm good at, right? Because you kind of objectively see how you're doing with stuff. Of course, I do this all now on spreadsheets on computer. But the other thing that's worth mentioning is when people talk about 8 or 10 hours of practice, whatever, don't be intimidated by that. And particularly, I want to talk about for a moment something that I think people get wrong. Okay, I never played video games, but I've talked to a lot of people who have played video games, and I've never run into a single student who played video games for hours a day, who was like going home from school and saying, "Oh my God, I got to play video games for 2 hours." Mm-hmm. No. It's fun. Mm-hmm. It's also not easy, from what people explain to me. If it was really easy, they'd get bored. It's challenging, but it's fun. So the one trick is figuring out how you can practice in a purposeful way to get better at things and make it so much fun that it's not like this burden that, oh my God, I got to practice. And you want to just get into the flow of it. You want it to be enjoyable, and then you do it more and more. And if you do it more and more and find something you love, it's crazy. After a while, you become the cat at that particular thing, right?
Right.
So the other thing is that it's not always the case that more time on something is better. Mm-hmm. So without even going into the details, I've had times where there's a particular thing I want a student to work on, and it takes a lot of concentration. It's very intense. And they're saying, well, I think I'm going to practice this 2 hours a day. And I'm like, no, don't do this. Make a rule for yourself. You can't spend more than 10 minutes on it. You're allowed to have up to 3 10-minute segments on it a day. 2 or 3 is fine, but you're not allowed, no matter if you get into it, you have to stop at 10 minutes. But during that 10 minutes, it has to be all in. You're not thinking about it, and because there are a lot of things that it's the quality, for some kind of things, the quality is key. And right. if you go and think, I'm going to practice for 2 hours, after 15 minutes, you're just wasting time. You don't put in the concentration that makes you better at the thing. Yeah. So I think that sort of combination of finding a way to make practice purposeful, choosing the right things that you want to get better at and the right ways to tackle them, and find a way to do that where it's very fun and engaging, like playing a video game. You don't want to waste your time on a video game because you can get better at doing cross rhythms on 7/4. Why would you waste time on a video game? Cross rhythms on 7/4 are much more exciting.
And much more fulfilling at the end of the day. What do you feel are the value of stepping aside from the practice room and what that brings to your practice. I don't know if that wasn't a good way of asking that question, but maybe you understand.
I mean, let me use the extreme example. There's a wonderful guitarist that almost no one's heard of. I might have told you about him back in the 1990s, Dave Kramer. He lives in the Bay Area in California. And I first heard about him because George Benson, in an interview, said to the interviewer, you see, the interviewer was busting George about doing more commercial recordings. Mm-hmm. And George is like, the greatest guitar players in the world are people, reviewers and interviewers like you have never even heard of. So the interviewer wanted to call him on it because that was a pretty challenging thing. So he said, like who? And George said, well, I think the quote was, the greatest living guitarist I know of in the world is a guy named Dave Kramer who lives on the wrong side of the railroad tracks in Oakland and has a bunch of dogs. So wow, George thinks he's the greatest guy. Who is this? By coincidence, or maybe not, my great friend Tuck Andrus, who lived in the Bay Area, I call him and ask, hey, do you know who this guy Dave Kramer is? It turns out he had started taking lessons with Dave.
Okay.
So Dave is the most extreme person in this particular way of anyone that I've ever known. He spent 10 years practicing. I mean,
exclusively.
I mean, and I hope it's okay for me to say it. He was looking back on it and laughing at himself. I mean, he would talk about, what happened? I think he broke up with his girlfriend. He moved into a room in his sister's house, and he just got into this thing where he's practicing. Not like 10 hours a day. I mean, he'd wake up and start practicing. Wow. I think, and he was kidding when because he had gotten out of this when I took lessons with him for a week. He said he was everything wrong. Smoking cigarettes, he'd have a pile of ashes on the ashtray, half-eaten TV dinner sitting there. I mean, it was crazy. And he said sometimes he was taking some substances to keep him awake even longer. So he would do these marathon things, and finally he would crash, fall asleep on the couch, wake up and start practicing again. And laughing at himself about it later on, he's telling me sometimes he looked down and realized that he hadn't taken off his cowboy boots and jeans. He hadn't taken off his cowboy boots for 3 weeks, and go out and shower, and his sister whoa, So, this guy, and he worked out stuff on the guitar that I've still never heard anybody do like Dave.
So it sounds like he didn't take any breaks whatsoever.
Right. But as amazing as that worked for him, I think there were some downsides.
Okay.
So when I was studying with him, and this is many years ago, I don't even want to say how many, this is I think it's before you were born, maybe. It's really long time ago.
Okay.
Right. He was telling me that he was already losing a lot of the stuff that he had gotten together during those years. And he wasn't really performing with people much. And I've thought about this a lot, this thing that, whether it's Wayne Shorter with Miles Davis or John Coltrane and McCoy Tyner and Elvin, this thing about the energy and the way things happen by performing. You're not just sitting in a room practicing. I think that stuff's really important. Mm-hmm. So taking breaks is important. Living a life is important. Playing with other people is important. Practicing is just one piece of this.
Yeah, and what you're saying there about...
by the way, consider playing with other people in a certain sort of way. You could consider that not exactly practice, but it's like a supplement. They're two different things that work towards the same direction.
Yeah. And what you're saying, I often feel that there's a difference in energy when you go to the gig between what you're doing in your practice room, because obviously in your practice room, there's a certain level of comfort, relaxation, you have your sound dialed in. When you go to a gig, there's all the adrenaline, the excitement, maybe you're wrestling with your sound.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that. Do you feel it's necessary or it's beneficial to practice, let's say, with a bad sound in order to better meet, what might happen on the gig?
I've gotten into that discussion with Tuck because I've been in situations like someone else is the leader on a group in a recording studio, and they have a really tight budget. It's like really great musicians, but this guy has a tight budget. And the engineer gives me like an excruciatingly horrible sound in the headphones. And I say, could we fix the guitar sound? And the leader's like, no, we don't, And so you're playing like it just sounds atrocious. And Chuck talks about embracing the sounding terrible and still playing great. So
how do you do that? What's the trick to doing that?
I don't know. We got to get Chuck in an interview to explain that.
Yeah, because that could really ruin your day when you go to the gig and your sound is not right, and it really changes the nature of how you play, in my experience.
And there's actually this question. I hadn't decided. I thought of this before, but I hadn't decided whether to go into this. But I think this is something that I feel, especially with guitarists, is very interesting to me. There's sort of a divide. I mean, it's a spectrum, and there's some people that are middle, but there's a certain kind of guitar player. If you want to say the negative side to it, you would say they play licks. But let me say there's some wonderful guitar players in this category. They're often very hard practicers, and the thing they do is they have this idea, they work it out, and on the gig, they're playing this thing, often with great technical facility, and you're kind of like, whoa, and everyone wants to say like, wow, what did that person play, right? And there's another kind of guitar player that's on the other end of the thing where they're trying to really improvise. They're trying to play spontaneously and not play a bunch of licks that they've worked out. It's funny how many guitarists are on the lick side.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, more than a lot of other instruments, I feel like. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I mean, you definitely hear saxophone players who play some licks, but guitar players are like, because the whole thing about fingering and all this stuff, there's a lot of advantages to working something out, especially if you want to really dazzle people. So there's certain guitar players that almost everything they do feels worked out like that to me.
Right.
And I tend to be attracted to, I enjoy that, but I tend to be attracted to people who are really improvising.
Yeah.
And I want to give, if guitar players think I'm talking super abstract, listen to Sonny Rollins. If I could, I've had a bunch of friends who played piano with Sonny Rollins, and I wish I have gotten it. I mean, he's still alive, but I think at this point he's not performing. I'm probably not going to get a chance for this conversation. But this whole thing, he practiced mega hours on the bridge when he was at the top of his profession, and he took a break and just practiced on the Williamsburg Bridge. And when I read his autobiography, I mean, he was like 12-hour days, 16-hour days, like really practicing a lot. And yet, I've heard this guy play live where there's not a single thing in a 25-minute solo that sounds like he ever worked on it in a practice room. It's incredibly spontaneous sounding. I mean, and I want to know the magic of what he practiced on the bridge that let him do that. Because now it's going to sound like I'm putting down Sonny Rollins for a second, but it's the opposite. I've heard this guy play tunes that are so simple and repetitious that they're almost like silly. Like you and I wouldn't want to play, like really going to play this 3-chord calypso over and over and over again, right? And I have friends who played in his band, but some of his bands, you and I would be okay to play with them, but it wasn't like Coltrane being uplifted by Elvin Jones and Jimmy Garrison and McCoy Tyner, although Reggie Workman would tell me maybe it's Coltrane who was uplifting them, but collectively, right? He had okay rhythm sections. I mean, they were fine, but here he is, and on a distant stage, like on Bryant Park, and I'm listening way far away, and this guy's playing on this silly tune, and he's playing this magical stuff.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the well is endless, and it's so spontaneous, and he's developing these ideas and developing them, and you're like, oh my God, like the brilliance, the spontaneity is incredible.
Yeah.
I wish I knew how he practiced for that. But let me say that if you do what Dave Kramer did, for example, or what a lot of other people do, a lot of time in the practice room, working out this stuff, you're never in the situation where suddenly a drummer does an unexpected rhythmic figure, or a pianist does this chord that so you don't have to react to things really quickly.
Right.
Well, a lot of the guitar players who play the licks, I know I'm sounding critical, they don't react very much. The pianist plays some cool chord and they just keep playing their stuff.
Right. It's a more rigid kind of style.
Right, but if you listen to Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock, the second great Miles Quintet, I mean, Ron Carter, Tony Williams, I mean, it's not just rote stuff they did in a practice room. Like, they're interacting and going all these unexpected places. And that's a lot of what's exciting about jazz music to me. So, you only get, I mean, it's hard to get that if you're not doing that. You've got to play with other people.
Yeah, and ideally that's, for me, is where you want to get to, where it doesn't sound like you're playing all of your licks and your patterns. With that being said, right, there is an aspect to practicing jazz specifically, especially, let's say, when you're more an intermediate player, right, where you're trying to ingest the vocabulary and you are going to records and pulling licks off. Do you have a process for, let's say, grabbing a lick and integrating it into your playing, and maybe even to the point where it does just become so natural that it doesn't sound like a lick anymore?
You know, there's someone who did a study of John Coltrane solos, transcribed all these things into a study of it. And there were certain things that you might call, it's always, my personal thing is I call these kernels. Like, I have books full of kernels. And a kernel is an idea, but it's not a lick.
Okay.
Let me try to give an example. Let me give a crazy example, is that you're playing augmented triads moving in minor thirds to create 12-tone rows. Well, but you can play in inverted, spread augmented triads or closed augmented triads. You can play different sequences of them. So in other words, you can, if you have that as a concept, you can do something different and different rhythmically. You can do something different every time. You could have 120 takes on some piece, and at that place where you're using that concept, you played something different every time.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like...
Right. So what I think about, to be more specific with your example, your question is what Randy and Mike Brecker described when they were young practicing. They would get a Miles Davis record and he would play a phrase that they loved. So first, of course, they'd learn to play the phrase, and they would learn how to play it in all different pieces of tunes and learn how to play it over a minor chord and a major, all the obvious things. Then they would start and then start messing with it rhythmically, and then start doing octave transpositions, and then start changing how the chromatic passing tones work, and then start changing what degree of the chord that they started. So, all these things, before you know it, they had a whole section of their language that all came from this Miles lick without ever playing the Miles lick. You might never know that that's where that language came from.
That's interesting. It sounds like what you're saying is they're examining a concept from all different aspects. And then I can imagine that in doing so, you come up with so many different variations that it can easily flow into the rest of your vocabulary.
Yeah. And by the way, when I started mentioning the Coltrane thing, when this guy had studied things, think about a formula like da-boo, 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 things like where you're playing a minor chord and doing something where it's root, major seventh, minor seventh, sixth. If you're listeners, some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. So Coltrane that was sort of a little vocabulary thing he used. Uh-huh. But the person transcribing it noticed on each solo, he did it differently. In fact, the author suspected that Coltrane even consciously battled to not do the thing that his fingers would fall in the way he had done it before.
Yeah, that's tough, yeah.
And of course, another thing that's really exciting with all this, and it's kind of the big missing piece to a lot of the education thing, I feel, is the whole rhythm thing. Because they're pretty good resources for studying harmony and studying melody. More harmony than melody, but there are things like Slonimsky. There are a lot of things that even work about integral patterns and stuff, but people haven't really known how to study rhythm. So
Yeah,
quickly,
and I want you to talk about your rhythm books, because
Right,
those are incredible. Like, tell us about the whole
So
series
here's
of
a
it.
very quick advertisement. First two volumes take you from the beginning about sight reading and notating rhythm. It's not the main focus. A lot of people seem to think that that's what rhythm's about. That's just like a tool, but you need to have that tool to do certain other things, like to be a good sight reader, and also to completely get a lot of things that people want to communicate about rhythm. If you can't read the rhythm, well, you hope that they recorded it. Well, I did make more than 2,000 supporting MP3s for these books, but I still think it's useful if you also know how to read and write the things. But the other books are all about rhythmic concepts, all kinds of concepts in 4/4, all about cross rhythms in the context of harmony and song form, all about odd meters and changing meters, and then all the really crazy advanced rhythmic superimposition, feel superimposition, metric modulation, feel modulation, transformational analogs, blah blah blah.
So it really gets pretty advanced, pretty complex.
And so more than 2,000 MP3s, and it takes you through things very systematically. So this is a great thing to work through with a teacher if you have a teacher that wants to work through this stuff with you. And by the way, you don't have to listen to every one of the 2,000 MP3s. You don't have to do every exercise. What the way I did it is you hit different topics, and then there's a topic you want to go deeper in. There, it's available from the book and from the MP3s and the worksheets to go deep into everything.
And where can people pick these up?
Although they're on Amazon, I have to say the best way and cheapest best is therhythmbooks.com. Maybe you can put this in your description of the YouTube. They're crazy inexpensive for what they contain and what the 2,000 MP3s give you. But if there are people listening from other countries, apologies, I can't do anything about U.S. Postal Service for international shipping. And it's pretty expensive. I mean, I've had people buy one volume in Europe, and they pay like 2 or 3 times as much for postage as they pay for the book. On balance, it's still a good value, but it's sad to pay that much for postage. So
right.
But this gives you a way, in the same way that you can sort of in a systematic way work on something like chord voicings, or harmonic progressions or whatever. This gives you a systematic way to work through all kinds of rhythmic things.
Now, one of the big key concepts you talk about is practicing not just playing the part on your instrument, but vocalizing it, maybe imagining it, clapping it. Can you talk about why those different modalities of practice are so helpful in learning and internalizing rhythms?
Okay, let me give you a bad joke that I made up that my students have heard. So you know what life is like, Craig. So you've got those wonderful moments when you're practicing, you got the guitar in your hands, you're reading music, writing music, you're on the bandstand. It's fantastic, life is great. And then there's all the wasted time. You know, you're on the beach with your girlfriend and the sun's setting, you're going to a restaurant, all this wasted time when you're not doing the music, right? Well, now you've got a way to keep getting better musically, even during that wasted time.
Okay.
Because there's so much you can do practicing away from your instrument. And it turns out that if you do this, I mean, we could talk about specific things that you could practice, but if you, for example, I think back in your class, I was showing people how to learn to play in 7/4, right? And so I gave people an ostinato to sing and ways to clap and walk and all this stuff. And the nutty thing is that that's most of the deal. If you're walking down the street and you get good at doing these different things in 7/4, when you come to an instrument, for a moment, the harmonic rhythm is a little different playing in 7/4, but that's quickly you got that, and then you're playing in 7/4 grade. In other words, it's internalizing the thing that's the challenge. It's not oh, how do I put my finger on the guitar in 7/4? That's no big issue, you know.
Yeah.
So
Can you demonstrate one or two ways that you would internalize it, like in terms of counting or clapping? Let's say, I don't know, would take an odd meter, 5/4 or 7/4.
sure, 7/4. I think I've put this someplace on the internet, but your viewers probably haven't seen it. Boom bop dee be be dee be be dum dum dop dee be be dee be be dum dum bop dee be be dee be be dum dum dop dee be be dee be. First thing you want to do is just sing that ostinato over and over and over again, way more times than you think I could possibly be imagining you would do it. So much that it's like, if you've ever heard a bad pop tune that gets stuck in your head and you keep hearing it over and over again,
Yeah.
you're walking down the street, dum, dop, dee, bee. It's like, shh. Right. So you want to get to that point. Okay. I'm giving you a really abbreviated version of this. Try doing it clapping different ways. I was clapping half, half, dotted half, 2, 2 plus 3, or short, short, long. You can do it tapping half notes. Boom bop dee be be dee be be dum boom bop dee be be dee be be dum boom. So every second time you're clapping on the offbeats, right?
Okay.
So you get good at doing all different speeds. Boom, boom bop dee be be dee be be dee, and also boom bop dee be dee be dum boom bop dee be dee. So you go with all these speeds. Notice what isn't happening is there's no math and there are no numbers.
Okay.
It's all just doing the ostinato and feeling it. Now, it's interesting when you walk down the street, probably, unless you want to walk step, 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 right? Probably you're going to be walking step, 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 step. So dum dum dee be dee be dum dum bop dee be dee be dum boom bop. Okay, so you're walking half notes, singing the ostinato, but tapping half, half, dotted half with your hand. Okay. All right, so these are all things to get it internalized. Once that is completely internalized, you don't have to think about it, it's automatic. Now you could hit the mute button sometimes. So as a recording guy, you know what I mean with mute. The thing's still going on, you just don't hear it for a moment. So it sounds like, maybe like, I'm gonna do this just clapping on beat 2. So boom dee be dee be dum boom bop dee be dee be dum boom bop dee be dum dee be bop ba dum boom bop ba dum bop ba dum boom dee be dum. So you hear I'm muting things,
Right.
and maybe when you start out you don't mute so much.
Okay.
So you're
Just
hearing
making
it.
sure that you're actually really internalizing it and
Right. So
comfortable
you're
with it.
feeling the whole thing internally. You're just not singing it all out loud. Of course, at a certain point, you're feeling it so strongly internally that you can mute a lot. So it's going like boom, bop, dee be dee dum, bop, biddy, bop, ba dum. So more and more. So now you've gotten very good at muting it, but feeling the 7/4. There are no numbers, you're no counting, you're just grooving. You do that for quite a while. Now, finally, when that's cool, you can start improvising little things vocally in the spaces you're leaving.
Okay.
I have to warn your viewers that I'm the worst singer ever on the planet Earth. So be
Not worse than
forewarned.
me.
No, maybe. I got to say, this is one area where I think I surpassed you, Greg.
Okay.
In being
We'll see.
the
We'll
worst
see.
singer. So you keep coming back to the ostinato as much as you need to, but you're filling in the holes improvising.
Wow, that's interesting. Do you find that vocalizing like that translates then to your instrument?
Very strongly. And
Okay.
I'm sure that this thing I came up with was later in my teaching career than when you were in my rhythm class, but I worked out a way. I have an entire 2-hour class where people start singing like in a circle. We're clapping, we're singing something all together. Then we start making it call and response. And the response everybody sings, which is just the thing we've been singing. And the call is a space. And one by one, the students improvise in that space.
Okay.
And we go around in a circle and you hear what the other people have done. And after a while, you've done it a few times, you might be cool, but let's do something different. Don't just keep doing what you've done before, right? So you do this. Then we make well, I don't have to give you all the details. But after a while, it becomes a longer thing where you have a longer space to improvise. Then after we've done this for a while, where we're clapping together, we do the whole thing and you're not clapping. So now we just have to feel the 7 all together, and there's no crutches, Wow. And by the time, it's really funny because most people have never spent a day in their life where they spent 2 hours in 7/4. So after like an hour in 7/4 doing all this stuff, then we pick up instruments and do the exact same thing, but now you're playing it on your instrument. Well, that's very interesting because some people, it's just the same when they play their instrument as when they sing. Other people have a much easier time singing it than playing it, and some people have a much easier time playing it than singing it. But that's like a telling thing that each person can observe about themselves, right? And then after all that, we would play a tune together in 7. And by this time, after an hour and a half of doing this, like, whoa, like some people are already sounding great at it, but even if they're not sounding great yet, they see they see their shortcomings and they see what they have to work on. I just wanted to mention that there are some different ways of practice that some different friends of mine have pointed out that I thought, wow, that's really not the way people usually practice. Okay. So let me give you 2 examples.
Yeah.
Friend Bob Gillis, wonderful trumpet player and composer from Colorado, from Denver. And I'm not sure if I'm remembering the exact chord he told me about this, but he told me about a way he practiced. Well, it came as a response to my question, because this guy was so great at improvising over chord changes. He wasn't the most technically virtuosic trumpet player, but you give him a new set of tricky chord changes, and he's playing like beautiful notes, beautiful melodies. Like, wow, how did he get so good at this?
Yeah.
So when I asked him the question, he smiled, and I'm going to say for my paraphrase of this thing he told me a long time ago, let's say it was B diminished. So he told me he realized one day that every time he played on a B diminished chord, he was kind of, sorry, I'll be unexpurgated, he was kind of bullshitting on it. Okay. And if you think about tunes like B diminished, you're in rhythm changes, B flat, B diminished, you've got like 2 beats on it or something. It's very easy to skate over B diminished, and nobody notices, nobody says, oh, you got to work on your B diminished. Everyone thinks you're cool, but he knew he wasn't deep into B diminished. It was kind of skating over it every time it came. And of course on trumpet, I'm using a particular key because B diminished on trumpet's a lot different than D flat diminished, you understand? So he just got angry with himself, like frustrated. He said, I'm going to learn B diminished. So he spent an entire day, he told me, just being B diminished. Every different way he could play on it, every different melodic thing, every systematic pattern thing, every not systematic melodic ideas against all kinds of chords, just be diminished. I think he said it took a whole day of practicing it, but his B diminished was...
Yeah, his B diminished was slamming.
B diminished was his friend. So he thought, that was interesting. So then he thought of another chord that he'd never really played. So he started doing this one by one.
Yeah.
And he said at a certain point, someone puts a chart again in front of him, and here's this chord he's not so cool on, another chord, and there's B diminished. And so through time, he started finding that more and more of the chords in the charts were his friends.
That's amazing.
And then one day, every chord was his friend.
Yeah.
If I say the story, you you and I, being how we are, immediately start calculating and saying, well, my God, he would have to work on hundreds of chords if he's doing each chord in every key.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and you know what? If we're all lucky, everybody listening to this, if we're all lucky, we're going to be alive and healthy hundreds of days from now, and we could do what Bob did,
Right.
or we could still be playing on charts, and every time we come to be diminished, kind of just fake it.
Now I'm inspired. I need to put a date on my calendar for Be Diminished. You know.
I mean, I've never done this thing systematically like Bob has. But if you heard this guy play on chord changes, and by the way, of course, there's more to it than that, because it's also how you connect the chords.
Right.
And this is a thing a lot of intermediate players, if you hear them play, they're playing something on each chord in a progression. They're not playing things that are playing across the chords. So it's more than just one chord at a time.
But you could dedicate a day to like 2 chords and how they connect.
Right. Of course, you could expand it, from there. A completely different kind of wacky way to practice that's a very guitar specific thing is from my friend Tuck Andrus. And again, I'm talking about him. Please, if you haven't heard Tuck Andrus, if you don't even bother listening to me, well, you should listen to Greg. But if you don't bother listening to the rest of us, please listen to Tuck Andrus, because it's so inspiring. It's so incredible. And guitaristically, like, it's mind-boggling the stuff he does. Anyway, an example of something that Tuck would do, and he told me this, I thought, man, I've never done this in my life. Tuck has great time and great rhythmic feel. But Tuck said he would pick up the guitar and he would start strumming a 1-chord funk vamp. Right. For an hour.
Wow.
Non-stop. I have plenty of students that I've never run into anyone who's done that. And the thing about Tuck is he wouldn't quickly change from one thing to another, but he said there'd be little things that developed over the course of the hour. And it started out like a pretty good funk group. And an hour later, it was like there were little things that had developed that it was like killing.
Wow.
So sometimes this idea about just giving time or something, and one more, another guitarist with a different version of that, John Abercrombie. I was in he was giving some little workshop, and I sat in it once, and someone was asking him some question about playing on a mode or something, and the students are at a level like, oh, well, so-and-so Phrygian, that's so-and-so major scale starting in the 3rd degree or something. And what John Abercrombie showed is how he would work on that. He would just play on that mode. It's a little bit like Bob on Be Diminished. He would just play in that mode like for a long time and really take in the flavor of that mode, like really own that mode. And I guess, as I said, it's a different version of the Bob Gillis thing. Yeah. But it's interesting that jumping from thing to thing too quickly, sometimes there's stuff from just spending on time on something can get you further than you would expect.
This is actually a really interesting approach, because I could see you almost making your daily practice routine just simply each day, I'm just going to take one thing and I'm just going to absorb it fully.
Yeah.
And in a way, it kind of almost simplifies your practicing, because you're just like, I know what I'm doing today. Tomorrow I'll pick the next thing.
And of course, you also, it turns out that Tuck and I, when we were both in maybe in early 20s, we did this quick calculation about how many hours in your life you're going to have to practice. And this was, Chuck used to spend a lot of time practicing. So this assumed a lot of hours a day and assumed that you live to a pretty ripe old age, but not to 112. Like, let's say, we're 20, let's say, well, let's say if we keep on this practicing until we're 85, and it turns out it's a lot of hours, but it's not that many hours. It's a little bit scary. It's not that many. Okay. Which is just to say that it helps to figure out just what I started out with about what your goals are. It helps to figure out where you really want to get to, because it's pretty hard to become the greatest person at every single thing. Mm-hmm. Right? And so And then it's also very good, I mentioned quickly to you before, this idea about divide and conquer. You find a hurdle and you divide and conquer. So let's say, for me, sight reading on guitar wasn't the be all and end all, but I just realized, if I can do this, there's certain opportunities to play with great people that I'll get that I won't have if I can't do it. So I want to get a certain level with sight reading on guitar. So people come to me as students and they want to get better at sight reading. And I ask them, well, what's your limiter? They don't even know what I'm talking about. So then I'll watch them, right? And I'll have them like sing the thing they're going to play. So maybe their limiter is they can't sing the rhythms. They can see the pitches really quickly, but they can't sing the rhythms. Okay, divide and conquer. Let's just work on the rhythms. Of course, my rhythm books have a jillion examples of that. Or they're just a little bit slow at finding the pitches on the guitar and fingering it. Different set of things we do to get good at that.
Okay.
Or, here's a really common one. They're looking at the music, they're doing this. I realize they can't play without looking at the guitar neck.
Mm.
Well, then you can have all the other skills and still suck at sight reading, right? So then I'll tell them, just start playing with your eyes closed or looking the other direction. Every gig you have, every time you're playing, don't look at the guitar neck. At first they said, well, that's really hard. I can't do that. Time on task, you get good at it. But realize if all they wanted to solve is like, oh, I'm not a good sight reader, it seems like this overwhelming problem. As soon as you figured out what the limiter or limiters are, you can do like a really specific way to tackle those.
Right.
And that's, I feel like as a teacher, when I talk about it's not cookie cutter, it's different with every student, that sometimes I can help people figure out what the real limiter is and how to tackle it.
Right. And I feel that's something that you really can't get from YouTube. As wonderful as YouTube videos of licks and things like that, what you're saying is that the teacher can really find the sticking point, right, for you, and then almost create an exercise that boils it down to just the essence of what you need or where your hurdles are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's some other problems if you're trying to learn this all from YouTube. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of bad information out there, sure. And it tends to be difficult to separate the bad from the good. And by the way, the number of views that something has, based on what I've seen, doesn't have that much correspondence to, not so much correlation to how good it is, right?
Yeah.
And there's no overview, there's no sequence of how you should progress from one thing to the other. It's just random stuff which you might not be seeing in any kind of order that makes sense. And it's not addressing your specific goals and your specific hurdles. So it's all those problems.
And that sequencing part, I feel, is just huge. As simple as it sounds, it's sort of like a good teacher will know what to prescribe you, just like a doctor says, okay, you're here, I think you need this as your next step. Yeah. And, I also wanted to ask you, just in general, how you feel about attention span these days. In terms of students and practicing, because I've definitely found with some students that the idea of deliberate practice, repetition, it seems to me that a lot of these things are more difficult for people these days because they do require that attention span and that focus.
Yeah. I do feel like it's an issue, but it's different from person to person, and I would try a two-prong approach if this is someone watching feels that that's an issue. Mm-hmm. A two-prong approach. One is, of course, trying to extend your attention span. I don't have a great solution to how to do that. Okay, but probably a psychologist who worked on this, you could see what they have to say. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is to figure out with what you've got how to work most effectively within that. So what would be an example? Well, an example is if sitting in front of the guitar and trying to play all things you are in 7/4 for 40 minutes, you can't, after 5 minutes, your head someplace else. Well, if you have to walk to the bus stop anyway, practice singing the ostinato, you'll get the seven, in other words, it's the stuff we talked about. Mm-hmm. There's a part of practicing that even for me not so much when I was younger, even for me, is a little bit tedious. And what I mean is there's certain neuromuscular things that just take a lot of practice, a lot of time on task to get really good at them. And like there's a song I'm going to record soon where there's a part to it it's got crazy rhythmic things and stuff, treble and bass stuff happening at the same time that are really nutty. It's very hard to physically play on the guitar. So I thought about my friend George Garzone, tenor player I played. Yeah. And George says, I practice a lot in front of the TV set.
Oh, really?
I mean, but now I'm not sure. I've never listened to his practice in front of the TV set. Yeah. There's a friend of mine who died recently, Mike Miller, who played with Chick Corea and some other people.
Oh, yeah.
He used to practice in front of the TV set so much that he could play every single commercial and the theme from every single. I mean, I knew he was a TV guy, so I didn't even have a TV for most of my life, so I wasn't doing that. But now sometimes I'll have a certain amount of time where I'm practicing a physical thing, really concentrating on it, and then I'm trying to practice it without thinking about it. I'm not saying that's the best use of your time. I've heard some scientists say total concentration on the thing makes your time on the task more efficient. But I know that I'm not going to do it for more than 25 minutes if I'm just focusing on that. So, but if I do that first, and then I'm reading the New York Times online or watching a movie or something and making it happen over and over again, I feel like there's neuromuscular value to that. But that's only for certain things in practice that you can do that productively. You're not going to understand the modes of harmonic minor if you're distracted and doing something else. So,
right. So for more of the things that should become automatic, sort of.
Right. So all I'm saying is it's part of this general thing I said about the student actually kind of studying themselves as they go and finding out what works best for them. And if attention span is an issue, figure out how to make, what would the cliche be? Make lemonade out of lemons. Mm-hmm. Like figure out how there's something about your attention being able to jump from thing to thing that you can make into a virtue. I'm not sure what it is, but maybe there's...
Awesome. Thank you so much for this discussion. I really appreciate.
I hope all of the listeners are realizing the task Greg has to either edit the hell out of this thing or decide if he puts up something this long, if you're actually going to watch it.
I've kind of lost track of time.
And if I wasn't aware of the time going so quickly, my intention was to ask all of these same questions of Greg, who's also a very strong guitarist and probably has some different answers than I do with a lot of them. I have to say, the big thing about practice to me is if you figure out how to do it that works for you and you are moving towards these goals and getting better at playing music, and I guess I'm talking especially about jazz, but I'm sure it's true in shred metal and all kinds of other styles. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's super fun. It's super exciting. Like it's never boring. And the rhythmic stuff, especially to me, is, all these years teaching it, I'm totally fired up about it. And there's always new stuff. I can go to my own books and find things that I've never had a chance to work on, and harmony and transcribing solos and figuring out different ways of practicing and working on different kinds of phrasing that you've never thought about and working on specialized guitar techniques, all kinds of ways to do slap harmonics. I mean, double string bends. It's like so much stuff.
It never runs out.
I mean, maybe if you live to be like 500 years old, eventually it would get boring. But I don't think so, because you would keep making up new stuff. I mean, so
it's endless. It's endless.
So, if somebody watching this feels stuck or frustrated or bored, you've got to find a different path, because that's not intrinsic to the music. That's something about where you're at right now. You've got to figure out a way to get past it. Yeah,
exactly. I agree completely. All right. Well, thank you, Rory, once again.
Greg, you're a marathon runner, at least when it comes to interviews. Thanks for hanging in there so long.
But you're the
Great
real
to
marathon runner. So, all right. I'll see
talk
you.
more about other stuff soon. Great to catch you.